Now you should have some general understanding of how the born axes work, but it's not always simple to visualize, especially when dealing with the basic RK node, where there's a lot of things going on. And what can be simpler and is also very useful to learn anyway is making one bone point in a specific direction or point towards a target. So that's what we're going to look at next. So I'm just going to unhook the forward solve and move it somewhere else. And what we're going to do is right click and search for aim. And there's a node called aim. And what this will do is you'll tell it a specific bone and you'll tell it a target. And what it will do is it will try to point the bone at that target. So the example case that I mentioned earlier, we're going to make the head point at a specific location. So firstly, let's make that location. So let's take our right pole vector. And if you didn't follow along with that stage, don't worry, just right click on any bone, do new control, and then right click again on the control that it creates and then click on parent. And then you can rename it to whatever you want. So I'm just going to rename this one to look target and compile and save. And I'm going to position this somewhere in front of the character. And remember that because we've moved this control and we want it to stay there whenever we compile, once you get it into a suitable position wherever you want it to be, you can right click on look target and do set offset transform from current. Now we compile and it stays there. So what we're going to try to do is make the head bone point at this location. So we've got the item, type is bone, the name we're going to search for head, connect the execution path up, and its head goes upside down. And the reason for that is we've firstly not specified the target, so it doesn't know what it's aiming towards, and also we've not set up the born axes. So for the target, what we're going to do is drag in our look target and do get control. And we're going to drag the translation into target. So now it's trying to aim at this, but what you'll see is it's not actually aiming at this target point, or at least not in the way we expect, where it would be pointing its face towards this target. It's pointing the top of the head towards that target point, which is obviously not correct. But Control Freak has no way of knowing what part of the bone or what part of the skeleton is trying to point at this. All it knows is that there's a bone there, a target here, and it tries to point at it. So what we actually want it to do is make sure that the forward bone, which is going to be the direction the face is pointing, is what we want to align towards this target. So that's where these axes come in. So if we go back to our skeletal mesh in the skeleton editor, and we'll search for head, which is the bone that we're manipulating. And again, you can press W to go to the translation tool to see these axes. You'll see that the direction that the character's head is facing is going down the y-axis. So it's the green axis, and down here you'll see that's the y-axis. So the direction that we want to align with our target is the y-axis of this bone. So we want to make the y-axis of this, so this green arrow, we want to make that be the thing that points towards the target. Not the red arrow, so we don't want to align the x-axis. Not the blue arrow, not the z-axis. It needs to be the y-axis. So here you'll see that currently we've got it at the x-axis, which is why he's pointing the top of his head towards his target. So we'll set that to 0, 1, 0. And okay, so now he's pointing his face towards this target. You'll see that his face is always tracking this. But you may, if you're paying close attention, notice a small issue. He's got his head twisted to the side. So even though we know the axis that we want it to point towards, so we know what side needs to align with this point, and it is correctly doing that, the problem is it could align to this point in many ways. The head could be on the side, it could be on the opposite side, it could be upside down, it could be any position in that roll axis, so clockwise or anti-clockwise, while still pointing at this point. And that's why we need to specify the secondary axis. So the secondary axis is going to be the one that we want to point up or away. So in our case, the red axis, we want that to always be pointing upwards, or at least aiming to point upwards. Sometimes if the head is tilted backwards, this won't directly be pointing upwards because the head will be leaning back, but it will more want to aim upwards rather than downwards, or to the left or to the right. So we want the x-axis to be the secondary axis, and we want that to target a point somewhere in the air. So back in Control Rig, we've already set up primary, but there's a drop down for secondary. So firstly, the target for the secondary, we want this to be somewhere up in the air. So let's just do 0, 0, 2000. So it's just straight above the character somewhere. But for the axis, we want to set that to the red axis, which is the x-axis. So we're going to set that to 1, 0, 0. And now you can see that the head is tracking this control, and it's always pointing up when it can do. But just as an example, the head isn't directly pointing up, but it's aiming to do that. And because it's a secondary axis, it kind of takes a lower priority than the primary axis. So the primary axis is always being forced to point at this location. The secondary axis is just having some preference to point upwards rather than downwards. So if I set this z value to -2000, it's saying that the secondary axis is down below the character, and that's the direction that the head should be pointing, or the top of the head. And you can see that that results in not what you'd be wanting if you're trying to make the head look at a certain direction. So we're going to leave that at 2000, so it's up in the air. Now the head is pointing towards this point correctly. What we're going to do next is make it so it's not only the head that moves, but also the upper body. So rather than him only moving and looking at this object based on his head position, he's going to twist his body around as well.